Good morning. Anyway, my story is a transnational story, as it were, focusing on a man who was born in County Galway, who became a global revolutionary, I suppose, fomenting unrest from Johannesburg to Vancouver to Sydney. Now, Tom Glynn's most significant work was in the Australian labour movement, and I suppose it's appropriate we're discussing him at a time of unprecedented immigration from Ireland to Australia. Now, insofar as Tom Glynn is remembered, it is as one of the Sydney 12, members of the IWW, or the Wobblies, who were charged with treason for their anti-conscription activism in 1916. They were convicted on perjured evidence, as it turns out. And in this regard, Glynn and his comrade Tom Barker are mentioned in Andy Irvine's song Gladiator. Some of you may be familiar with the song. Now, the photo here, which I think, are you able to see at the back, was taken on the release of the Sydney 12, 4 years after their incarceration in 1916. Tom Glynn is there in the second row on the left with his daughter on his knee. Can you see that? That's Molly Glynn. Her earliest memory, in fact, was...
Which character is Tom? Is it the gentleman with the child on? Is he second in that row?
He's in the second row left. Yeah. Okay, so that's it. Right. Young Molly's earliest memory, in fact, was of trying to pick out her father in the line of defendants in the courthouse. She's probably 2 or 3 at the time. She also recalled a jail visit when she managed to slip a bar of chocolate into her father's pocket. And she also recalled refusing to stand for the national anthem at school assembly as a mark of loyalty to her father's cause. And for that detail, and for others indeed, I'm indebted to members of the Glynn family in lots of continents, and it's great to see so many of them here today, in fact, some of the Irish relatives. So I'm at the early stage of my research on Tom Glynn. So today I'm going to spend about half the time talking about his formation and half, I hope, talking about his anti-war activity in Australia. I'll be drawing on research on Australian syndicalism by Verity Bergman and on South African anarchism by Lucien Venderveld. Slide. We got it here. So, Tom Glynn was born at Clough, Gurteen, County Galway in 1881, and thanks to Michael there for one of the images. He was the third child of Mary Toohey and John Glynn. Tragedy entered his life at age 2 when he lost his mother. So his father remarried within 2 years, so Tom's earliest memories are of a stepmother rather than his mother. There are 5 further children, I think, from the second marriage. The Glynn family's economic circumstances weren't too bad. John Glynn was a herdsman. He was employed by Lord Dunsandle. It was potentially a contentious employment, controversial employment during the Land War, and of course Gurteen was a centre of the Land War. Interestingly, the occupation of herdsman was the only unionised occupation in Irish agriculture for an extended period, but that's another story. So he came from a union house, essentially, probably, though we don't know the detail. He attended Temple National School, still standing, though no longer in use as a school. And he had several notable contemporaries. People played roles in the agrarian and nationalist movements. One Gurteen contemporary I will mention was Sean McGillar-Nall, who, like Tom, became a newspaper editor. He edited on Clive Thullish. And in this room I should mention that he wrote the first biography of James Connolly, which was published in 1917. In 1899, still at the age of 17, Tom Glynn headed for Melbourne, following his older brother Pat. An uncle who was manager of a cattle station or a stockyard near Melbourne found work for the brothers as stockmen. So this continuity with their father's employment, drawing on family skills, I suppose. Now, Melbourne was the capital of the colony of Victoria, which in January 1901, as you know, joined with the other colonies to form the Commonwealth of Australia. Tom Glynn, however, didn't wait for federation. Having arrived on the 12th of April 1899, we find him aboard a ship, the Euryalus, 11 months later, bound for South Africa and the Boer War with the 3rd Victoria Bushmen. Now, the 3rd Victorias was one of a number of units we might describe as proto-Black and Tans. They were recruited in response to the Boer guerrilla tactics. So you might think, coming so recently from a farming background, engaged in social conflict in Ireland, that Tom Glynn might have had some qualms about burning out Boer farmsteads, as his unit was obliged to do. This doesn't seem to have been the case, because not only did he serve his full term with the Victorias, but he went on and signed up for another term with a similar unit, the Imperial Light Horse, who were raised among pro-British elements in South Africa. The tone of some of his journalism his later journalism, however, hints at some maybe retrospective regret about his role at that time, but not evident in the early 20th century. Now, at the end of the war, he joined the Johannesburg Town Police. He got married early in 1905, at the age of 25, to Delia Rochford, who was probably a Sligo woman. Later in 1905, he applied for leave to take his new bride back to Ireland to visit his sister, who had married shortly after he had left, and with her husband, Peter McGann, was a shopkeeper in Monivea. So that's where he was applying to go back to, if you see the form there. Tom and Delia's first child, christened Catherine or Kathleen, was born in Monivea during that visit. Now, the South African War had made an impact on the Monivea area. There always has to be a Gaelic football reference in any story involving County Galway. But clearly the sympathy of Irish nationalists lay with the Boers rather than with empire that the empire that Tom Glynn was defending, as it were. The leading Gaelic football team in County Galway in 1905 was the Athenry de Wets, as they were called. They were 3 times county champions. They were named in honour of the Christian de Wets, the Boer general, and precisely a few years earlier, Tom Glynn had been chasing de Wet around in the course of the so-called de Wet hunt, so that his unit had been involved in. So some kind of ironies and so on there. Now, the few years after Tom Glynn's marriage are missing years in my research. They're years that feature in the recollections of a number of people who knew Tom Glynn rather. So they're important years in terms of some sort of politicisation or radicalisation, certainly. He was dismissed from the police. The cancelled means his leave was, it refers to that on the document. But evidently he was successful in winning reinstatement. And he seems to have taken a redundancy package, such as it were, with the reduction and amalgamation of the Transvaal Police in 1907. So we next locate him as a conductor on Johannesburg's new electric tramway. And in 1910, he was the first tramway worker in Johannesburg to join a new syndicalist trade union. He was among the radicals in the same year who took control of the Witwatersrand Trades Council, and he was a contributor also in those years to the Labour Press. Early in 1911, he was instrumental in renaming his union the Industrial Workers of the World South African section, thereby identifying with the American Irish Industrial Workers of the World movement established in 1905 and specifically with the radical anti-political Chicago wing of that movement, which was led by Big Bill Haywood, that movement later known as the Wobblies, which with people like Joe Hill and so on we associate, and James Connolly indeed. In South Africa, interestingly, that union prided itself on organising on an interracial basis. In January 1911, there was unrest among the Johannesburg tramway workers, culminating in a strike. Now, Glynn's IWW secured solidarity support of workers in the power station that powered the trams, and the company conceded an inquiry into the workers' grievances. This was followed quickly, however, by another strike when the inquiry was perceived to be a whitewash, and in the subsequent strike, the authorities employed scabs. They discredited the strikers as well by having provocateurs place dynamite on the tram line, and this was proven subsequently to have been the case. In any case, the strike was broken within a week, and for breaches of the industrial relations legislation, Tom Glynn subsequently served 3 months hard labour, he and one other comrade. On his release in 1911, he found himself blacklisted throughout South Africa. Soon he would leave the country and head for the United States via Liverpool. His good friend and fellow Wobbly, Tom Barker, later gave a short account of Glynn's trip. Following this, he tracked to Galway, Ireland, and then made for the States, which he toured in hobo fashion. After a wheat harvest in Calgary, he went down below among the Macura's fires and worked his way back to Australia. So he was, that can be verified from the passage records. His route can be verified. Back in Galway, because he did drop by to Monivea and Gurteen, there were changes. John Glynn, his father, was dead, but the family in Gurteen, the status of the family, I suppose, had changed somewhat. Under the reforming land legislation of the era, the family, or specifically Tom Glynn's mother-in-law, was now listed as a farmer, whereas her husband had been listed as a herdsman 10 years earlier. So under the land reform legislation, they'd got some of the land that generations of them had herded for the Lord's Dunsandle. Continuing from Galway onto the United States, by Glynn's own account, he made contact with IWW locals in a number of places in North America: New York, Salt Lake City, where Joe Hill was later executed, as some of you would know, and he became a member of the New Westminster local near Vancouver. Vancouver, where he spent at least some of his time, is a centre of intense Wobbly or IWW activity in 1911-1912. You have a free speech fight. You have railway construction where the Wobbly leads some strikes during the summer. And there was a call sent out to Wobblies throughout the United States to descend on Vancouver. So that's possibly the context in which Glynn arrives in Vancouver. Certainly, it's from this moment in 1911-12 that the most common explanation for the name of the nickname of the Wobblies, the mispronunciation of a Chinese supporter who couldn't say the W. That's associated with Vancouver at that particular moment. So it's just indicating that it's a key moment. It's also the moment when the Wobblies identify with adopt to a greater extent than formerly the tactic of use of sabotage and so on. So it's an important moment in Wobbly history. So Glynn is at the heart of that world at that particular moment. It's only 8 months that he's in the United States, so you can't say he played an enormous role, but he was at the centre of things for a brief period. Now, arriving in Australia, Tom Glynn was now clearly separated from Delia in Johannesburg, and they were divorced in 1915. But within 3 months of disembarking from the Madura, Glynn made headlines for a court appearance arising from a street meeting in the Sydney suburb of Darlinghurst, when he referred to King George V as a bald-headed, knock-kneed parasite. Anyway, so that was covered all over the Anglophone world, believe it or not. I saw reference to it in dozens of newspapers. He was back in court a few months later on charges arising from another street meeting, and I suspect some of this type of this is the type of activity that the Wobblies in the States would have been involved in, free speech and drawing attention themselves, possibly, and their issues through such meetings. His day job was on the Sydney trams, but those brushes with authority indicate he had become prominent in the Australian IWW, which, like its American parent, was bitterly divided. Glynn became a leading member of the militant and anti-political Chicago wing. Up to that point, the Detroit wing, which was essentially a front for Daniel de Leon's Socialist Labour Party, had been more prominent in Australia. But with Glynn's arrival, the adherents of the Chicago line in IWW became dominant. By the beginning of 1914, just over a year after Glynn's arrival, the movement, the radical wing, were in a position to publish a monthly paper, which went weekly, in fact, in 1915. Glynn is the editor of this paper, Direct Action, and until later in the year he handed over to Tom Barker, but he remains a regular contributor and the de facto business manager of the publication. Just a quotation from his comrade Tom Barker here about him. Glynn had a magnificent style of provocative writing, great flow of English, could reduce things to their essentials. Direct Action became, in my opinion, one of the most formidable newspapers that have been published, and so on. I suppose testimony from a colleague. So a formidable and a radical paper then, but what was the nature of the radicalism of the IWW? The wobbly wing, as it were. IWW members would have described themselves as revolutionary industrial unionists. And since their industrial unionism, or their syndicalism, derived there as elsewhere from the industrial and political context. One part of the context is illustrated in the title of a Tom Glynn pamphlet, Industrial Efficiency. But industrial efficiency isn't a good thing from Tom Glynn's point of view, or from his comrade's point of view. This is the era of Taylorism, which diminishes the independence of artisans and groups like miners and lumbermen. So for Glynn and the wobbly constituency, industrial efficiency was a bad thing in that it interfered with the freedom of the worker. The other significant factor, I suppose, at the time, in terms of the emergence of this radical anti-political type of union movement, was the disappointment at the achievements of labour in the industrial and political fields. Syndicalism advocated the one big union, which would organise by industry rather than by craft. It opposed arbitration schemes of all sorts. They were in vogue at that time as tying the hands of trade union negotiators. Politically, at this time, Labour is a growing force. In Australia, it formed the federal government as early as 1904, but it had disappointed the almost millenarian expectations placed in it, and that created the opening, I suppose, or the constituency for syndicalism. Direct Action, the newspaper, reflected these concerns, together with placing an emphasis on sabotage as a tactic in industrial relations. The idea of sabotage, however, as advocated by the IWW, seems to have been about working to rule rather than actually destroying things, going slow and so on. But needless to say, it caused tremendous alarm. What was the The one poster of the Australian IWW went, "Only fools and horses work hard." Anyway, the Sydney Wobblies were a propagandist outfit, and they had to accept a kind of dual unionism, that their members would be members of other unions as well. Trade unionism had grown greatly in Australia during the previous decade, and so as not to belong to the established union in many of the major employments would have been regarded as scabbery, so people were members of those unions advocating an IWW position. Now I move on to the war, having placed given context, as it were, the formation of Tom Glynn. War broke out within 8 months of Direct Action's establishment. And this war, the war would propel the IWW in Australia into public notoriety. Under Glynn's editorship, the paper took a vehement position against the war. You have a Labour government at federal level in Australia under Billy Hughes, which enthusiastically embraced the war effort. So units of the movement, trade unions, political and so on, went, actually that's not the slide I wanted to show. Yeah, anyway, where's the one I wanted to show? Yeah, there's the one I wanted to show. Trade unions and labour branches and so on were disinclined to be too critical of the Labour government, even though generally they remained anti-war. You have this striking cartoon on the front page of the first issue of Direct Action, published after the war was declared, together with an editorial from Tom Glynn, setting the tone for the next few years. He criticised, and I quote, "the hangers-on of the system, the whole hosts of rulers and statesmen, pillars of church and state, politicians of every hue, are all endeavouring to infect the workers with the microbe of patriotism, to shatter the bonds of the ever-increasing international fraternity and solidarity of the working class." Now, the IWW's focus in Australia on anti-war activity excluded almost everything else very quickly. And it reaped a certain reward, because you have a substantial anti-war constituency, which wasn't really being catered to since Billy Hughes and the Labour Party leadership went into support of the war. Attendance of meetings went from dozens or hundreds to tens of thousands of people in the Sydney domain, that is IWW meetings, and about 500 such meetings were held in the first 2 years of the war, which were addressed by people like Glynn, by Tom Barker, who I mentioned, and others, including Peter Larkin, who was in that first photograph. I meant to point him out, who arrived in Australia in 1915. And of course, not everybody is receptive to the anti-war message. The pro-war press would have whipped up hostility to the allegedly pro-German traitors of the IWW, and meetings were often attacked by drunken soldiers and so on. To the accusations of disloyalty, Tom Glynn had the following riposte: "The cry of disloyalty and traitor is being freely hurled about by the Labour parliamentarians. But there can be no greater traitor than he who is disloyal to principle, disloyal to class, and disloyal to his pledged word," reference to Labour's pre-war position in relation to the war. "If one looks for traitors of this type, one need go no further than the criminal crew who are the so-called Labour leaders of this state." Now, the British handling of the 1916 rising in Ireland would affect the attitude of Catholic Australians to the war, and in Direct Action in June 1916, Glynn wrote about the rising, specifically about Connolly, whose execution he described as callous, premeditated, cold-blooded murder. A subsequent review that he wrote of a pamphlet by Connolly indicated some mystification of about Connolly's motives for joining the rising. However, there's little sense in general in Glynn's writing of any identification with Irish nationalism, though his party piece apparently was Emmett's speech from the dock. Peter Larkin was the person who was sent out by the IWW to address Irish groups rather than the Galway men. and it would be the same when both were members of the Communist Party later on in the early 1920s. Now, the government was facing difficulties on several fronts at this point. Recruitment to the army is way down, and there was labour discontent also due to rising prices. Prime Minister Hughes was persuaded to introduce conscription in Australia following a visit to Britain and following the example of the mother country. The divisions there were in the Labour Party deprived him of a majority, however, in the Senate, so thus the need for a plebiscite or stroke referendum. He wasn't confident of his majority. So the whole, I think in Brendan's paper later, there's the quote on conscription in Ireland refers to hostility, indignation and fury. Well, that also sums up what happened in Australia with the efforts to introduce conscription. At the same time as the decision was taken on the referendum, a political decision was taken to clamp down on the Wobblies in Australia. Generally, wobbly propaganda was seen as demoralising in the context of the war, the anti-war posters everywhere, and the big meetings and so on. And you even have a Labour volunteer army established under wobbly influence in the Broken Hill mine, several hundred strong, pledged to resist conscription. Of course, the material such as this here, produced by the IWW, is subject to censorship. If you look at this one, the poster there, it's an effort to get around conscription. They argued it's they're urging particular types of people to join up. In fact, it's kind of subversive of the, as you can see. So Tom Barker was charged for printing that poster. And he ultimately won his case. However, he lost a subsequent case for publishing this cartoon, which shows businessmen kind of coining it and worker crucified in a subsequent paper. Barker was fined, refuses to pay the fine, gets 12 months hard labour. And it seems it was Glynn who actually was in charge at the time. It should have been him that was prosecuted. But Barker wasn't going to point the finger at at a comrade. So Barker's imprisonment for this cartoon and the campaign for his release would lead to the prosecution of Glynn, Larkin and the others of the Sydney 12. Glynn, in the editor's chair of Direct Action, gave certain hostages to fortune. They called for sabotage to secure Barker's release. And these public threats of sabotage enabled the state to build a case against them. And with the rapid growth of the wobbly movement, there were people who had connections with criminality and so on. So people were, some of these were persuaded to testify against the IWW leaders rather than face prison themselves. Evidence certainly was manufactured, but the intemperate language of the Wobblies themselves gave the evidence a certain credibility. In particular, there were fires which broke out in Sydney in the previous period, and these were linked retrospectively to the thinly veiled references to sabotage in the propaganda, in the Direct Action, and so on. Glynn, for example, was recorded as saying, "Far better to see Sydney melted to the ground than to see the men of Sydney taken away to be butchered by infidels. The king and Kaiser and manufacturers of munitions are war criminals." So this is how then the next development was reported in Direct Action. Just before midday, on Saturday, September 23rd, the IWW Hall in Sussex Street was raided by a small army of detectives. At the time of the raid, there were about 17 members of the organisation on the premises. Fellow worker Tom Glynn, who was the editor of this paper, along with fellow worker Peter Larkin, Jack Hamilton, Charles Reeve, Don McPherson, were arrested and taken to the Central Police Station, where the four first named were charged with treason. Now, these arrests were made with an eye to the plebiscite on conscription, which was scheduled for late October, just a month after the arrests. Prime Minister Hughes and the leaders of his party in New South Wales judged that high-profile trials of the most radical faction of the anti-conscription movement would bring discredit on the whole anti-conscription cause. The anti-conscription movement was a very diverse coalition, including a lot of people in the Labour Party and trade unions, and it even extended to Cardinal Mannix, very recently, who'd gone over to take up his job from Maynooth College. He was in 1913, I think he was left Maynooth. So Catholic sentiment in Australia is very much affected by the 1916 Rising, in particular the executions and so on. The initial charges against Glynn, Larkin and the others were based on an archaic charge of treason felony. Again, this is with an eye to the referendum. It should be said that these charges, this strategy didn't work for the government. The government lost the referendum very, very narrowly, kind of like our divorce referendum, I think, of 95, such a similar margin of less than 1%. So, but they lost the referendum on conscription. And you might ask, to what extent were Glynn and his comrades responsible for stopping conscription? Historians differ, but I'm inclined to agree with Verity Bergman, who argues they were central to the outcome, especially for their role in splitting the Labour constituency, as it were, in relation to conscription, and for having begun an anti-conscription campaign about a year before the idea was actually mooted. Certainly the Labour constituency in Australia voted overwhelmingly against this measure, which was promoted by the Labour government. And the very narrowness of the results, obviously, further supports the view that the role of the Wobblies had to have had an effect. Now, the result, have I got 5 minutes? Or just, yeah, okay. The result of the referendum prompted the exodus of Hughes and others in the government from the Labour Party. They left the Labour Party and they reconfigured the government on a more reliably right-wing basis. And politically, then, the referendum and its result had a huge impact on Australian Labour. And in the aftermath of the referendum, however, you still had to conclude the business of the trials, and these trials proceeded. They dropped the treason felony charges so as to be more certain of successful prosecution, and seditious conspiracy was a charge, together with arson, of which they were convicted. Most of them got 15 years. Glynn declared, "I'm no criminal, and no verdict of the jury and no sentence that your honour may impose can make me a criminal." With regard to the 12 more generally, there are a number of developments, and the Wobblies more generally, in the aftermath, which were significant. Their movement and their paper were successfully suppressed during 1917. However, the rerun referendum was defeated even by a larger margin than the first, with the Catholics more involved in the second, in fact. Now, difficulties faced Glynn and his comrades in prison. You have obviously particular worries for those who had families. 3 of them had spouses and children. No, got it. Sorry, now. There they are. You can probably recognise Peter Larkin here, and his wife and child there, and Bill Teen and Glynn. They had families. The penal system was, well, penal, and it was worse for the IWW men who got a hard time from prison staff, not unexpectedly because of their position against the war. Peter Larkin faced disciplinary measures a couple of times, but Tom Glynn seems to have knuckled down and did his best to quietly serve his time. He learned French. He taught himself French while he was in prison. Donald Grant, who was later a prominent Labour politician, he was sentenced with Glynn. He wrote a memoir of the time in jail, and he recalled 1,001 annoyances. He wasn't told about his mother's death, for example. The letter was held from him. And when he became ill, necessitating a visit to a specialist in Sydney, he was placed in a straitjacket and marched through the streets as if he was in a danger to himself or the public. Grant's memoir was entitled Through 6 Jails, so that's the number of jails that were moved around to, some of them in the interior in very places like Goulburn, where temperatures range from 35 degrees down to minus 15. So you can imagine the impact of that on of those conditions on badly fed prisoners. Outside, families struggled, sometimes moving house to be close to where their husbands and so on were moved to. Molly Glynn recalled being taken by her mother at this time in terms of the other difficulties of employment and so on. She remember being placed under a sewing machine where she had to remain still and quiet. Alicia Ginn also took in lodgers, including one notable literary figure, but I won't get into that. The personal experience, of course, of the families and the prisoners was one thing, but there was also a public side to it all. Following a period of inchoate protest and occasional collections, structures are put in place to support or partly support the dependents of the 3 family men and to secure the release of the 12. Starting with the Wobblies, the campaign extended throughout the labour movement and indeed beyond Australia. Delia Larkin organised a meeting in Dublin to draw attention to the plight of her brother and of the rest of the 12. Jim Larkin sought to travel to Australia, but he was refused the necessary papers to go to lead a campaign there. Obviously, in Australia itself, there's a number of strands to the campaign. You have a kind of constitutional campaign associated with the Labour Party for their now without Hughes and co. And then you have a more radical campaign led by wobbly type elements advocating worker militancy to force their release. Insofar as they were publicly able to express their views, the prisoners seem to have favoured the latter approach rather than the constitutional approach. The authorities watched carefully, suspicious that the release committee was merely a front for the suppressed Wobblies. And the end of the war in November 1918, and I'm getting there now, towards the end I think. In November 1918, with the end of the war, naturally people would expect they're going to be released now. Prisoners after 1916 in Ireland were out by Christmas in most instances. 2 years have gone by, but there was no such... there's letters, in fact, from Alicia Glenn to the Dependent Support Committee, which are quite poignant in this period as she looks forward to being reunited with her husband. The fact was this pathological hatred of the IWW in the Australian establishment, which is confirmed by the memoirs of Billy Hughes and others indeed. The turning point was the election of a minority Labour government in New South Wales in the spring of 1920, which was a government under pressure from its grassroots. It was snowed under by resolutions from union branches all over Australia, but more significantly, it was dependent on the support of 2 independent Labour members who had been associated with the campaign to free the 12, and a kind of a Gregory deal was done whereby they agreed to support the government in exchange for the release, for the establishment of a commission to investigate the case. A sympathetic jurist was brought from Tasmania. None could be found in New South Wales, and he came up with the result that was desired. The outcome was that most of the original convictions were overturned. Glynn and Larkin were found, for example, to have been innocent of all charges except for conspiracy, and that already served enough for that. So 10 of the 12 were released immediately. That's the photograph, and that's August 1920. So Glynn then, and this is the final thought, he emerges. People remark on how pale, broken looking he looks into the daylight from Long Bay prison. It's a very different world from the world he left 4 years earlier. In the far left, I suppose, the significant event that's happened is the Russian Revolution. And it would have impact on the way people behaved and people thought. Tom Glynn found himself in great demand, and he did his best to adapt to the new situation. For a number of years, he was one of the most prominent people on the Australian left, and he was editor, in fact, of the first newspaper of the Australian Communist Party. Wrote the foreword to the message from Zinoviev from the Communist International, and so on. I don't think I'd shown you those mugshots, or had I, from Long Bay. Anyway, I've, I think, trespassed on enough of your time. Thanks.